I'm going to be highlighting key terms from the Interpersonal Chapter, pages 183 to 191 of your reading. And the reason why I'm doing that is actually your interpersonal exercise covers that stuff. And we're going to have a little in-class time to sort of cover that in groups as well. So after I'm done highlighting these key concepts, we'll do some group work, and that will hopefully prepare you for your interpersonal exercise that's coming up. So what we're going to talk about in this lecture today are the developing, maintaining, and declining stages of relationships. And communication tends to look distinctly different and serve distinct purposes throughout those stages. Early on, we talked about one of the course objectives here is for you to really understand the importance of human communication. And one area that's incredibly vital for you are your relationships. The way that you talk to one another is going to have a huge impact on whether you end up having healthy relationships or relationships that continue to be short-term or shorter term than you want them to be. So you want to be very conscious about the way that you communicate. All right, so first, in communication looks different in this first stage that's known as initiating. And the initiating stage tends to be when you're communicating kind of on that script level. Hey, how you doing? Doing good. Great. And then you move on. Hi, my name's Johnny. I'll be your server. What would you like today? We're not really establishing a genuine relationship at that point in time. You go through the checkout stand. They tally up things. They give you your total. You give them the cash. Right? That initiating stage is when you're actually coming into contact with other human beings, but the communication itself is not really deep. The next stage is this exploratory stage. And probably a lot of you have gone through this, and you may have even gone through this in your first time that you were working together as groups. The initiating stage would be maybe, Chris, the kind of relationship that you have with Brooke. I bet you it's just gone to the, hey, how are you doing? Perhaps you've seen her in the hallways from time to time and had that little script greeting. Don't know for sure if you have or haven't. But that's where your relationship is. I bet if in your groups, though, you actually know something about the people. You know something about their personal lives, how their weekends have gone, those kinds of things. The exploratory stage is when you're really first starting to create a little bit deeper connection with people, where you're starting to have a little bit of small talk with them. How was your weekend? You and I even just engaged in those behaviors at the beginning of the class. How was your weekend? Oh, this is how it went, etc. All right? So you're starting to establish a little bit deeper bond and exploring whether or not you think you could have a little bit deeper connection with this person or not. The initiating, you're probably never going to have that concern, whether you can or cannot have a deeper connection with the person passing in the hallway or your checker, etc. But the exploratory stage is when you're going to ask questions where you think, well, the answer to this question is going to determine whether or not I can actually have a relationship with this person beyond just, hey, how are you doing? What kind of music do you listen to? I listen to jazz. Oh gosh, I'm totally into death metal. This person is never going to be my friend, right? So that's that exploratory stage, trying to find out exactly where this relationship could and cannot go. The intensification stage is when we move beyond that sort of trying to get to know one another. Now we're really starting to get to know one another, and we feel a connection to this person now, where we're having deeper disclosures. All right, so I joked around in the earlier lecture about disclosures that it's good to have a self-monitoring behavior. On speed dating, you wouldn't say, oh yeah, I'm 28 years old, I work at the sugar beet factory, I have herpes, and I like long walks on the beach, right? Okay, this stage of intensification are where those kinds of things might start coming out. If you're actually, say, if you're in a romantic relationship with somebody, before we move much further along, if you have herpes, now's probably a good time to let the person know, all right? So intensification is when you're having like deeper disclosures, things that actually make you a little bit more vulnerable to the other person. It's not the type of thing that you'll tell to everybody. It's an intense disclosure. In your book it says pet names sort of start to become part of this intensification stage. So in a relationship, honey, babe, etc. Or you and your friend, I don't know, you might have Tank is your friend's name. Perhaps you got wildly drunk on one weekend and now all of you and your buddies call him Puke, whatever the case may be, okay? So it's where you have these names with each other that not everybody in the outside group starts to use with you. In communication in the intensification stage, there's something that's known as idiosyncratic communication. Idiosyncratic communication. And what this means is you have special rules for the way that you communicate with somebody else. In the intensification stage, this is where we would start to see idiosyncratic communication. All right, so for instance, my wife and I, our first 2 years of marriage, we lived in a studio apartment. This is while we were both in school. Incredibly small. It was like our bed took up 4/5 of the front room. And she had this thing where she would lose her pillow in the middle of the night and ask me, where's her pillow? And I would say, did you check the PDB? Nobody here has any idea what PDB means. And the PDB was the pillow deposit box. Over the course of the evening, her little pillow would fall between, because there was just a small little crack between the bed and the wall where she would work her way out in the morning so that she could go get ready for school early in the morning because she's an early riser. And I'd get up around 1 o'clock. So I would say, did you check the PDB? I called that little crack the pillow deposit box. That's an idiosyncratic version of communication. It's something that she and I share that outsiders do not, would have no idea what that is. If you're starting to have that kind of communication with people, special rules, this is an example of you being in the intensification stage of a relationship. All right, these are the 3 levels of a developing version of communication. And there's actually a great little chart in your book that talks about it moving from a level of not very intimate to deeper intimacy. So we're climbing the ladder of intimacy as we move through these stages. Right? The next stage is this maintaining stage, which is incredibly important to relationships. If you don't spend the time and put the correct kind of focus here, what you're going to find is you have relationships that intensify, they develop, the maintaining stage is quick, and they decline very quickly. All right, so the maintaining stage is where you start to have integrating communication. All right, so the integrating version of communication is when you really start to see yourselves as one. You might say something like, they're playing our song. My best friend and I, we love that movie Tommy Boy. And we'll quote Tommy Boy back and forth to one another. That's our movie, right? So you have things that are yours. You would be offended if you saw somebody that you have this deep relationship with involved in this activity that's special for you. Right? It's the thing that makes you guys you. So for instance, Brian, I don't know if when you go out rock hounding, if you always go alone, but you may have some friends that you go out and do that with, right? So this would be a stage where you're integrated. This is what we do. We rock hound together, right? So the integrating stage is where you're seen as one, all right? You see yourselves as one. The next stage of it is the bonding stage. And the bonding stage of communication is where you've actually gone through some kind of formal acknowledgement, some public acknowledgement of the nature of your relationship. All right, so for instance, usually in romantic relationships, you might go through an engagement, a wedding ceremony, those kinds of things. That would be an example of a formal ceremony. Amongst best friends, when I was growing up, we used to do the blood brothers thing. So I don't know if that's common in younger generations. In the book, it says we don't do it too much anymore because of HIV and those kinds of things. Although at 8 years old when we were doing it, I don't think we were really thinking about those things. But the bonding stage is when you do like blood brother ceremonies. It used to be fairly common that you would see best friends forever, the girls that would wear a heart necklace and one of them would be split in half and their best friend would also have the other half of that heart, etc. So some kind of jewelry, some kind of formal public acknowledgement. This is when you're in that bonding stage. When not only you yourselves see yourselves as one, but also other people tend to see you as one. So it's no longer, let's invite Johnny someplace. It's pretty much always, wherever I go, let's invite Shelley and Johnny. And most people wouldn't even think of it being one or the other, unless it's like a guy's night out, something like that, where it's clear it's supposed to just be dudes. All right, so the bonding stage. All right, next is the declining stage. Now, the book actually has a third category in here, uncertainty events. I cannot remember what their second category is on here. But for the life of me, I could not draw a distinction between uncertainty events and what the number 2 thing was. So I'm only going to teach you this one. All right. A lot of times relationships decline because things come into the relationship that create uncertainty. Most of us don't feel comfortable with uncertainty. We want to know what to expect. This is one reason why in a public speaking situation, at the very beginning, you tell people what you're going to tell them. You don't leave that uncertainty in here. You let them know why you're here. It reduces that uncertainty and allows people to concentrate on the content as opposed to feeling that tension. All right? So uncertainty events. Very common in a relationship that money is one of these types of uncertainties that will occur. All right, so you initially have this vision of when you're in this relationship, you're always going to be able to pay your bills on time. And then somebody loses their job. Right? Money can be a huge issue in relationships. It can change the way that the relationship functions, those kinds of things. All right, so uncertainty events. Another common thing that happens is, particularly for folks that are required to travel, distance. Perhaps some of you had your BFFs, and now they're off at Harvard or some East Coast school. And you thought there was no chance ever that you and your best friend could not feel incredibly close. And you're finding in the year or two that they've been away, you're growing apart. They're into different things, all right? So distance can be a huge thing that impacts a relationship. New friends and interests as well. So perhaps, for instance, for years, from the time I was about 9 years old until I would say really my early 20s, all I wanted to do was be a forest ranger. Every time somebody said, what do you want to do when you grow up? I want to be a forest ranger. Now, my activity and my outdoors, like my family has to really pull me kicking and screaming every time they want me to go camping. The last time I went hiking, I nearly passed out. Right? I've changed. I'm not the same person I was when I was 9 years old or in my early 20s. All right, so sometimes we just change. We have different interests, those kinds of things. All right, so these create uncertainty in a relationship. Over a long term, you marry somebody, and over the long term, it's inevitable that you and that partner are going to find something new that you're interested in, and it just very well may be that that partner is not interested in it. This is going to create tension in your relationship. It's going to create a new input that you're going to have to deal with. All right? So uncertainty events happen in this declining stage. All right, the other one, I skipped past number 2. Does anybody have their book open? They can tell me what that number 2 is.
You got declining, it's on page 186.
Okay.
Declining stage, you got the uncertainty events.
Yeah.
And you got interference.
Good.
And unmet expectations.
And that should be it, I hope.
And then you got relationship repair.
Okay, good. We'll go to that in a second. All right, so the one that I'm skipping by is interference. Because for the life of me, I cannot tell the difference between uncertainty events and interference. I spent about 45 minutes trying to work this out and couldn't do it. So I'm like, if I can't tell the difference, then we're not going to pretend there is. All right? Unmet expectations. This is also very common in relationships. All right. So, for instance, my wife just had a friend that went through this. She's been dating this guy for 2.5 years. She thinks he is fantastic. I mean, he is amazing. Everything she ever wants in a guy. One problem. She wants to get married and she wants to have kids. He does not want to get married and he does not want to have kids. This is an unmet expectation. When she visualizes how her relationship will move forward, these are the things that she will expect will happen on this relationship path. And he's got a different view of it. All right, so there's some unmet expectations. This is one that's very, very common. Do we want to get married? Do we want to have kids? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, he's just not there yet, but he needs to get off the fence and do it.
So would it be like a
You
difference?
tell Brian I should put you on the phone with him.
Should it basically be like a difference in expectations?
It sure is, yeah. Right? So, you might have a relationship where your vision of a relationship is spending 24/7 with this person. Right? That's what you think a healthy relationship is. And while you're spending time with somebody, you realize that this person wants to spend 3 or 5 days with you, right? And even when they're with you, they don't mind checking out ESPN from time to time to see if their team is winning, right? Okay, so there's some unmet expectations in the relationship, and this can create tension, which can lead to decline. All right? All right. Now, with that said, just because you realize that your relationship is experiencing some uncertainty events or some unmet expectations, and in fact, you should expect that these things are going to occur. All right? It doesn't mean that you have to proceed on that declining stage the entire time. There is a stage of communication in which you repair. Right? So some of the repair strategies that you would use is, number one, focus on the positives. Right? So in this developing portion of a relationship, it tends to be all roses. It's like, oh, this person is this and this and this, and you build them up into this ideal person who's on a pedestal, that kind of stuff. And then you get to the stage where you realize, okay, Johnny is not the be-all and end-all of the world, right? He does spend a little too much time checking out his Steelers scores, and I do, right? Okay, so it creates a little tension. So how do we repair this? Well, one is to focus on the positives. Okay, so maybe Johnny doesn't spend as much time with me as I wish he would. He does have other interests outside of just me. But there are lots of good things that are happening in this relationship, lots of needs that are being met, lots of great things about this person that I'm with as well. So if you can simply reframe a little bit and stop focusing on the things that a person isn't, and remember that they are a lot of things. And if this is a really deep need in your life, you can try to find that need met elsewhere, in other relationships that you have. It gets complicated if it happens to be an incredibly attractive man that meets those needs, right? This could create tension in the relationship too. But there's just things you can do to actually focus on the positive. Have realistic expectations. Okay, so a person is not going to be everything that you want them to be. They're always going to fail and fall in some way. All right? So have realistic expectations. If your vision of a person is a healthy relationship is 24/7, they're going to be doe-eyed looking into my eyes saying, oh, you're just so wonderful. Here's some more candy. Here's some more flowers, etc. All right, this vision, the white picket fence, all that stuff, never having trouble with bills, never having problems with health, never having a bad mood kind of day.
Is a lie.
Yes.
That's in movies.
It is in movies.
That's
Exactly.
What they project. That's what they.
Not the breakup.
Yeah, the breakups can be pretty ugly sometimes, right, in that movie itself. All right, so that repair stage can happen if you will just focus on that positive and also have some realistic expectations in your relationship. And the last thing is just reevaluate your relationship. Maybe your relationship isn't everything that it was in that developing stage, but perhaps some of the changes that are occurring are positive changes. Perhaps if somebody had gotten married to me when I was in my early 20s, they would have married a guy who thought he was going to be a forest ranger and be very, very active for the rest of his life. They'd be very disappointed at this point. Thankfully, she didn't marry me when I was in my early 20s. She married me when I was fat and lazy. So she already has
that repair work.
But maybe if I get active, then she'll have to adjust. Right? So reevaluate this relationship and say, okay, there are things that are changing in this relationship, but what kinds of things are changing that actually I can embrace? How can this be a good thing for us as well? So just reevaluate this relationship. I thought we were going to have the picket fence and 2 kids, but maybe we're not. And maybe doing apartment living and not having children would be a good thing because it frees us up to move every 3 years if we want to. Frees us up to have vacations. Hey, let's go to Tahiti this weekend. Great, I got no kids, we got a little money in our pocket, let's do it, right? So reevaluate that relationship and just embrace it. All right, and that's not to say that just because a relationship is in decline, that every relationship needs to be saved. All right, these are just some strategies you can use if you feel the relationship is worth saving. But some relationships decline because they're supposed to. All right, your best friend in high school doesn't always have to be your best friend forever. Right? You haven't violated any kind of contract. The fact that they're changing and you're changing and you have new interests doesn't mean that you're less of a person. All right, so sometimes relationships are just meant to decline, and you can embrace that. All right. Lastly, termination. There should be some kind of like communication transaction that happens to terminate a relationship. How many of you have that relationship where just for some reason you never talk to this person anymore, you never hang out with them anymore, but you never had a terminating conversation? How many of you have that? Isn't it a little bit weird?
No,
Like
it's
when you
weird
go-
when they call you out of the blue after 9 years of disappearing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird. And there's sometimes some resentment and bitterness there. It's like, dude, you just checked out of my life. You didn't even tell me what's going on.
They're like,
Anything.
yeah,
I didn't
hey,
expect
how
it.
are you doing? I miss you. And I'm like, what?
Uh-huh.
Who are you? Where'd you go?
Exactly.
Voice is
If you don't have a terminating conversation, it tends to lead to sometimes hurt feelings, bitterness, etc. And sometimes it just creates that like odd interaction. Both of you are perfectly fine with the fact that you're not best friends anymore. But then you walk and you see each other and you're like, oh gosh, what am I going to say? All right? So a terminating conversation tends to be a healthy thing. In your book, I really like the analogy that they use. They actually use two different types of terminating. There's one that's passing away, and the other is sudden death. Right? And the passing away relationship is that relationship where the signs are slowly coming. You both kind of know it. It's like a slow death. That's what happened in my wife's family. Her grandfather passed away a couple of years ago. But we had at least 2 years of medical malfunctions and medical issues to sort of adjust to that he was going to go. Some of you may have had a sudden death situation. A best friend or something that got into a car accident out of the blue, and they're just gone. All right, so relationships have this termination. Some of them slowly fade away, and you'll hear conversations like this afterwards. We've been growing apart for years. And that's what they'll say. That's a passing away. Others of you may have had friends or yourself have gone through a termination where out of the blue, somebody just breaks up with you. Happened to one of my friends years ago. His girlfriend broke up with him on Valentine's Day. He was really stunned. He went through about 1.5 years of some difficult times because he was really crazy about it. Right? So termination. There's this slow passing away and sometimes a sudden death. The way that you communicate in these times is also incredibly important. They're emotionally laden times for you. A lot of times it's really important to check what you say. Because the words that you use during termination, particularly if it's some kind of long-term relationship, a marriage that's going through a divorce, those words that you use in the terminating stage can have long-term impacts on the future health of the relationship, particularly if there are children in this relationship. All right? So sometimes silence is the best strategy. So termination is that stage we go through when we actually are ending that relationship.
Silence is the best strategy sometimes in the repair phase too.
It sure is. And you know, it's important for a lot of reasons. One, because if you're a person who tends to say things that you regret, just, you know, be quiet.
Like
But
that.
also, if you're talking, you're not listening. So it's important for you to actually just sit there and listen. And when I say talking, of course, you can paraphrase and things like that, but not really interjecting your own thoughts and feelings into it. So termination. All right, last, I'm sure that we've all had friends who have terminated and then reconciled. All right, so reconciliation sometimes occurs after a relationship has gone through this developing, maintaining, declining termination stage. Suddenly, 1.5 years later, your best friend and Kim are dating again. And you're like, dude, why are you guys back together? Right? Okay, so this happens sometimes where you can actually reconcile relationships, the on-again, off-again type of relationship. Sometimes they work out. The reconciliation process, perhaps it was an issue of unmet expectations and somebody matured. They're now grown up enough to be able to handle a mature relationship, those kinds of things. Or they went from being one type of person to another where the relationship can now function. I didn't used to want to be married and have kids, but now I do. Right, so reconciliation can happen, it can be a healthy thing from time to time. It tends to be that if a relationship has gone through all these stages and met with termination, it tends to be that reconciliation is going to follow a similar pattern because we're stubborn and we don't change very much. The same kind of communication that we used that led to termination in the first place will probably be our default strategy when we reconcile, and pretty soon we'll go through this pathway again and end up in termination again. Tends to be, but it's not always the case. All right? So reconciliation. Those are the stages of interpersonal relationships, and communication plays a huge role in the way that your relationships are functioning. Your exercise, your interpersonal exercise, asks you to look at some important relationship in your life. It doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. Friendships go through these same stages. Family relationships go through these same stages. And romantic relationships do as well. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just analyze a relationship in your life and try to identify which stage that it's in, and then look at some of the way that you communicate in this and ask yourself, what ways can I improve my communication in this relationship, etc.